for the stocking stitch, I'll need to teach you how to purl. So the garter stitch is made up of just knit stitches, which is what we were doing. And the stocking stitch, you alternate. You have a row of knit stitches, then you have a row of purls. They're called P-U-R-L-S. And then a row of knit, a row of purls. So I'm actually going to use this row of knit that I just did, so that's done. And that means it's time to purl now. So really, purling is just the opposite of knitting. So for knitting, I was going up with my needle on the right side of the first stitch on my left needle. And for purling, I'm going to go down with my right needle into that first stitch on the left. So knitting, you go up, purling, you go down. So I'm still going to take my yarn that's attached to the ball, and I am going to wrap from back to front. I'm just now scooping up and lifting off that way instead of scooping down. I'll show that again. So you're going down, still on that same right side of that outer stitch, keeping your stitches tight. You're wrapping from back to front, but because your yarn is all the way up here, you have to kind of wrap it a little bit more from back to front. And you're pushing up, really, instead of down when you're making your stitch. So it really is like knitting upside down, if you want to think of it that way. And this is trickier if all you've been doing is knit stitches. So as you're pushing your needle down, you can really think of this yarn as just kind of hugging the needle, because it really isn't back to front or front to back. You really are just kind of cloaking the needle all the way around in yarn so that you can pull it through, if that makes sense. So that was my row of purls. And the nice thing about stocking stitch is it's going to make this nice smooth V pattern. You can see my garter stitch is really chunky on both sides. My stocking stitch is going to be these little V's on one side and bumpy on another. I'll show you how that looks. So because I just purled, now I'm going to knit. So coming up instead of down. So now I think you can better see what I was talking about. See how my garter stitches are really chunky, and my stocking stitches, they kind of do look like a stocking. They're these V's up here. But from the back, you really can't tell the difference. It looks like it's garter stitch everywhere. But that's kind of the beauty of stocking stitch. It'll be V's on one side and the bumps on the other. So now that we know how to do both types of stitches, we're going to move on to seed stitch. Alright, as you can see, I've already started some of the seed stitch, but I will explain how to do it now. So the seed stitch is a combination of the knit stitch that we learned and the stocking stitch with purling and knitting. So for seed stitch up here, you are going to both knit and purl, but instead of how it was for stocking stitch where you knit a row and purled a row, for seed stitch you're going to knit a stitch and purl a stitch. And that might seem kind of hard to keep track of, but the nice thing about seed stitch is it basically shows you what you did last. So if you see a bump in the stitch, that means that this is a purl stitch. And if you just see a V, that means it's a knit stitch, which is a little counterintuitive because these stocking stitches are purls and knits and they have V's, and the garter stitches just have these bumps. But really, if you remember nothing else about seed stitch, it's that the bump here is a purl stitch and the V is a knit stitch. So because this is a bump and this was a purl, I'm going to start with a knit stitch, because what you're really doing is you are knitting your purls and purling your knits. So just like we did with our other knit stitches, I'm coming up on the side of this first stitch on the needle, going back to front, scooping that up and moving it to my right needle. Now the only difference here is I need to move this piece of yarn into the front when I'm purling. That's the only difference from before. So I'm going down because I'm purling, wrapping, catching the needle and moving it to the right. Sorry, catching the stitch and moving it to the right needle. So the way I like to think of it is you knit with this yarn in the back, going up, and you purl with this yarn in the front, going down. So my yarn is in the back, my needle goes up when I'm knitting, my yarn comes in the front, my needle goes down when I'm purling. And if you're ever going through a row and you're like, oh no, what did I just do last? You again just look at your stitches. Because it's a bump, that means this is a purl, so it means I'm gonna knit now. So I'm moving my yarn to the back to knit, to the front to purl. I'm gonna go just a little bit faster so you can see what to do with your next stitch the next time around. So this is a little bit tricky. I ended with a purl, which you can see on this side, but the only problem with working with an even number of stitches is you need to look from the side you'll be working from in the future. So you might be saying, you just purled, but I don't see a bump. It's because it's an even number of stitches. So you always have to look at what's in front of you, not what you just did, if that makes sense. So because I have a smooth non-bump here, I'm actually going to purl again to begin with my yarn in front. Because I see a bump here, I'm going to knit. That's the only thing you have to remember with an even number, is you kind of have to forget what you did in the last row so that it makes sense in the next one. If for some reason you did get your stitches mixed up, you would know right away, mostly from the V's. If you have multiple V's in a row like this, that means that you were off on your stitches somehow. So I really tell people, when you're working with an even number of stitches, it's really helpful for most patterns and for casting off, but it does make the seed stitch a little confusing just because you are only looking at what you've just done. So I'm gonna walk through this one more time. Yes, I just knit that stitch and it is smooth over here, but when I turn this over and start working with this as my left needle, I'm seeing a bump. So that bump, I'm basically treating this like a purl stitch, so I know to knit it. You kind of have to reserve your logic for this and really just focus on what you see in front of you, because I'm gonna need to knit this. Even though I know I just knit the last one, you just have to trust me. Basically, all you need to think to yourself is, if there's bumps, I need to knit them now. And if there's no bumps, I need to purl them now. and that is seed stitch. So I'm gonna do a lot more seed stitches to make a scarf here, and when we come back I will show you how to cast off. Alright, so we're back and I am about to show you how to cast off, but before I do that, you might run into this issue where you run out of yarn when you're making your scarf. So I want to show you how to join a new ball of yarn to what you're currently working with. So I'm doing the knit stitch right now, as you can maybe see, and I'm going to join this gray yarn to what I'm working on right now. So what I'm going to do is start like I'm knitting normally, going from bottom to top through this stitch in the back. But instead of grabbing my blue yarn, I'm going to grab this new gray yarn. I'm going to make just a loop here with the yarn and put that on my needle. So I'm going to hold these two pieces and complete my knit stitch with that gray yarn. And then I'll take that off. So I'm leaving the blue tail where it is. I have a gray tail here now, and then I'm going to be working with this gray yarn from now on. So I'll just finish the row. And it's probably going to be a little hard to see, but you can see that I have the two different yarns next to each other. And once I've done a couple more rows, I'll show you what to do with these ends, and then we will cast off. Okay, so we are so close to being done, but if you are like me and ran out of yarn, I want to first show you what to do with these two tails here, and then I will show you how to cast off. So this is right in the way of my design here. So the first thing I'm going to do is spread open this hole between these two colors and stick the gray in this opening to the left of this stitch. Pull that through, and I'm going to take the blue and go to the right of this stitch. Otherwise you'll undo your stitches if you don't go right in the right spot. So now I've kind of hidden that a little bit better, but it is still going to show on the back. So what I just do is just make a double knot, like you're tying your shoes. And then I just cut this. I don't mind showing that I have some extra thread here. So I have the knot. If you really don't want to show these ends, you can kind of tuck them in your stitches if you want to, but that takes extra time, and I don't mind having just a little knot here that shows that I have two different colors. I think it shows that it's handmade and it's nice, but if you did want to kind of stick everything in the sides here, you would keep your tails and just kind of poke with your needle and push things into the stitches like that. But we're going to go over casting off now. So I have my scarf. You'll see I have the garter stitch that we did, the stocking stitch, and then I did seed stitch all the way up until I did stocking stitch again and garter stitch again. So if you have even seed stitch, this will work, but it'll probably be easier if it's your first time knitting if you end with a knit stitch. So if you can get yourself back to knitting, that'll probably be easier, but you can do this no matter what stitch you're ending with. Just like I'm knitting, I'm going to knit 2 stitches, coming under that stitch in the back, wrapping from back to front, pushing down, and transferring the stitch to the other needle. We've done this a lot already. But now that I have two, because I'm casting off, now things are going to be a little different. So you're going to take the bottom stitch on the right needle, and I use my fingers for this. You can try to get your needle in there, but I think it makes everything too tight. So I just take my thumb and my pointer and I pull that bottom stitch. I'm going to actually pull it over this and then pull it off the needle. So I'm taking that bottom stitch. I'm going to hold the top stitch so it doesn't fly off with my right thumb, and I'm using my pointer and my thumb to pull that bottom stitch over the top stitch. So I just cast off a stitch and now I only have one. So I'm going to do the same thing. Whenever you're casting off, you always have to have two stitches on your right needle. So I knit another stitch, taking my pointer and my index finger on the bottom stitch, holding that top stitch with my thumb, sliding everything up. This yarn is really light, it's kind of coming apart. If you need to loosen your stitches a little to help, you can do that. But this yarn is going to be tough. Bringing that stitch over the top one. Knitting again. Pulling the bottom stitch over the top one. So I'm going to keep doing that until I have two stitches on my needle, and then I'll show you what to do for the final steps. Okay, so I'm about to have my final two stitches on my right needle. So now I don't need this needle anymore. I'm going to pull that bottom stitch over the top stitch. So now I only have one left. So at this point, I'm going to leave a tail. So I'm going to cut however many inches that is, probably about 4 to 5 inches. Make a cut. And then all you have to do is just take your needle and pull that final stitch through, and that secures the last stitch. I always double secure it, so I take this loop and I put the tail through the loop just to make it extra secure. Sometimes I'll do that a couple times. I just don't want to lose any of my stitches. I'll often even make a knot. So I have this big loop and I'm just gonna put the tail through it to tie it that way. And now you've cast off. It makes kind of this braid looking thing. Looks a little bit different than a garter stitch, but it's secured all of your stitches and you've made a scarf.